Amara, a new mother who faces an indifferent healthcare system just when she needs support the most. What begins as a simple hospital stay quickly becomes a challenging test of patience and resilience, as Amara encounters a nurse whose detached demeanor leaves her feeling isolated. But with a gentle ally on her side and the unwavering support of her husband, Amara begins to find her voice, turning her experience into a fight for compassionate care that will change lives far beyond her own. Will Amara's courage inspire a transformation in the hospital? Can a single voice spark lasting change? Join us to find out in this moving tale of resilience, empathy, and personal growth. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful, real-life inspired stories. And as you watch, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe one person can truly make a difference? Let's get into it. The day Amara Johnson gave birth was a clear, brisk morning in the heart of New York City. Outside the hospital, the city pulsed with energy, people moving in a rush, unaware of the small, tender moments unfolding within the building's walls. As dawn broke, Amara cradled her newborn, feeling a deep, quiet awe settle in her heart. This child was her everything, a new life, a new journey, a piece of her and her husband, Daniel, come to life. The maternity wing, bright and sterile, was a controlled world separate from the bustle outside. For Amara, it was a strange and foreign environment, a space filled with strangers but devoid of warmth. She was familiar with hospital settings from her community work, but as a patient, the experience felt alienating. She felt an odd combination of joy and vulnerability, her joy tempered by the underlying fragility of her situation. She pressed a gentle kiss to her son's forehead, and his tiny mouth opened in a yawn. "You're safe here with Mama, baby," she whispered, feeling the full weight of her protective love for him. She'd never felt this way before, this mixture of fierce tenderness and delicate uncertainty. The door opened quietly, breaking her reverie, and a middle-aged woman in navy scrubs stepped in, her expression professional, her movements precise and practiced. Her ID tag read Susan Whitfield. Amara recognized her as one of the senior nurses. She'd seen her flit from room to room with an air of efficiency. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," Susan said, her voice calm and collected but without warmth. She glanced at her clipboard and made a note. "How are you feeling?" Amara offered a small, tentative smile. "A little sore, but good. Thank you," she replied, trying to meet Susan's eyes, hoping for some connection. Susan gave a brief nod, her expression unchanging. "That's normal," she said curtly. She took a few steps to the bed, checking the four-line and adjusting Amara's pillows without a word. Her movements were efficient, mechanical, as though she'd performed these actions 1,000 times and had long since stopped finding meaning in them. Amara shifted, feeling a twinge in her back. She hesitated, then spoke up. "Could I maybe have an extra pillow? Just something to help with the soreness." Susan paused, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't look at Amara, but simply said, "We'll see what we can do." Her tone was polite but dismissive, as if Amara's request were an inconvenience. "Oh, thank you," Amara said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. She tried to tell herself she was just overthinking it, that maybe Susan was just busy. Susan finished her checkup, noted Amara's vitals on the clipboard, and turned to leave. She glanced over her shoulder briefly, her expression a shade softer. "You're doing fine, Mrs. Johnson," she said, a small but empty reassurance that didn't touch the faint line of tension on her face. As the door clicked shut behind her, Amara felt a pang of unease. There was something unsettling in the way Susan had looked at her, in the lack of warmth in her words. She felt suddenly small, as if she were more an object in a series of tasks than a new mother with emotions, vulnerabilities, and needs. An hour later, Daniel arrived, carrying a small bouquet of daisies and a broad smile. He was tall and strong, with kind, steady eyes that had been a source of comfort for Amara since they'd met years ago. As he walked in, the energy in the room shifted, warming, and Amara felt herself relax in his presence. "Hey, beautiful," he greeted her, setting the flowers on the side table and giving her a gentle kiss on the forehead. "How are you and my little man doing?" Amara's heart swelled as she gazed at him, her worries momentarily forgotten. "We're good," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Exhausted, but good." He took her hand in his fingers warm and reassuring. They both sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, gazing at their newborn. Daniel reached down to stroke the baby's soft cheek, his expression one of pure wonder. "He's perfect, Amara." "Yes," she murmured, feeling the fullness of her love and the contentment of this moment. But even as they shared in their joy, the lingering feeling of unease from her interaction with Susan gnawed at her. She thought of the nurse's cool demeanor, her dismissive tone, and the way she'd brushed off her simple request. She considered telling Daniel but hesitated. She didn't want to taint this moment of peace, didn't want to let the discomfort she felt overshadow the joy of meeting their son. The next morning, Susan returned, her steps brisk and her expression unreadable. She moved about the room with a detached efficiency, taking Amara's blood pressure and recording the readings without offering a word of encouragement or comfort. Amara found herself holding her breath, as though any question she asked might disrupt the delicate balance of the nurse's routine. "Nurse Whitfield," Amara ventured, her voice soft. "I know I asked before, but could I get an extra pillow? My back's been aching, and it's hard to get comfortable." Susan's expression tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "We're a bit low on supplies, Mrs. Johnson. I'll bring one if you find time." "Oh, okay," Amara replied, feeling her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She looked down, feeling as though she had asked for far too much. She found herself retreating into silence, unsure how to approach someone so closed off, so unwilling to meet her needs. As Susan left the room, Amara closed her eyes, a mix of frustration and sadness welling up inside her. She thought of all the times she'd been in hospitals before, advocating for others, ensuring they receive compassionate care. Now, as a patient, she felt stripped of her own voice. A few hours later, another nurse entered the room. She was young, with an open, friendly face and bright eyes. "Her name teg rids Emily." She introduced herself with a smile, her tone warm and genuine. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," she said, her voice a gentle contrast to Susan's. "How are you feeling today?" Amara felt a rush of relief at Emily's kindness. "A bit sore," she admitted. "I was wondering if I could get an extra pillow, just to help me feel a bit more comfortable." Emily nodded immediately. "Of course. I'll be right back with one." Within minutes, Emily returned with not only a pillow but also a soft, warm blanket. She helped Amara adjust, arranging the pillows and blankets with a thoughtful touch. "There you go," she said, smiling. "Is that better?" Amara smiled back, her relief evident. "Much better. Thank you, Emily. You've been so kind." Emily's eyes softened. "It's my pleasure. Just let me know if you need anything else." As Emily left, Amara felt a renewed sense of comfort. Emily's small act of kindness had filled the room with warmth, a reminder of the kind of care and compassion she had longed for. It wasn't much, but it meant the world to her in that moment. And yet, a part of her couldn't shake the contrast between Emily's warmth and Susan's icy indifference. Later that evening, Daniel returned, bringing Amara's favorite snacks and a small stuffed animal for the baby. He noticed her subdued expression immediately, his brow furrowing with concern. "Hey, is everything all right?" he asked gently, taking her hand in his. Amara hesitated, unsure of whether to share her discomfort. She didn't want to burden him, but the weight of her interactions with Susan had become too much to ignore. "It's just my nurse." "Susan," she began slowly. "She's been so distant. Every time I ask for something, I feel like I'm bothering her." Daniel's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he listened. "Distant? Has she been rude to you?" Amara shook her head slightly. "Not rude exactly, just indifferent. It's like she's annoyed with me for even asking for help." Daniel's expression softened, though the concern didn't leave his eyes. "That's not right, Amara. You deserve better than that." "I know," Amara said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it." "It's not a big deal. It's your care," Daniel replied firmly. "And if you're uncomfortable, we need to address it." She smiled softly, grateful for his support. "Thank you, love. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that." They sat together in silence, a quiet strength between them. For Amara, Daniel's support was a reminder that she didn't have to face this alone, that her voice mattered. As the hospital settled into the quiet rhythms of the late evening shift, Susan took a moment to sit alone in the break room, her usual composed expression briefly giving way to exhaustion. She wrapped her hands around a steaming cup of coffee, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers, a small comfort on an otherwise long and demanding day. They shared a quiet moment of mutual appreciation, both recognizing that their bond had been forged in one of life's most vulnerable experiences. Their shared values had turned into something lasting, something that continued to benefit others long after Amara's hospital stay. As they spoke, Mrs. Grant joined them, her face reflecting the pride she felt in the work they'd accomplished together. The three women shared a moment of reflection, united by their commitment to compassion and the positive change they'd created. In the years that followed, the Amara initiative grew beyond the hospital, inspiring other healthcare institutions to adopt similar patient-centered care models. Amara became a sought-after speaker, sharing her story with audiences of medical professionals, patients, and community advocates. Her story became a case study in compassionate healthcare, a reminder of the profound effects of empathy. Daniel continued his work with healthcare advocacy, using his experience with Amara to support families in need. Together, they became a team, advocating for policies that prioritize patient rights and dignity. Their shared journey had transformed into a mission, one that brought them closer and strengthened their resolve to make a difference. Emily, now a leader within the hospital, continued to mentor young nurses, passing on the values that had come to define her work. Her influence extended to every new class of staff member, each of them inspired by her dedication to patient-centered care. And Susan, once resistant to change, had become an advocate within her own right. She found joy in sharing her journey, proving that it was never too late to grow, to embrace new ways of caring, and to build a legacy of compassion. On a warm spring day, Amara and Daniel walked through the halls of the hospital, now transformed by the legacy of the Amara Initiative. They paused by a small plaque honoring the initiative's founding and Amara's role in inspiring it. As she looked at the plaque, Amara felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her journey had come full circle, and she knew that her story had left a mark far beyond her own experience. She reached for Daniel's hand, feeling his warmth and steady presence beside her. "This is what we hoped for," she said softly, her voice filled with pride and peace. Daniel nodded, his gaze full of admiration. "And it's only the beginning." As they left the hospital, Amara felt a renewed sense of hope. She knew that the values she had fought for, compassion, empathy, and resilience, would continue to shape lives, creating a future where every patient felt valued and every caregiver felt empowered to make a difference. Their journey had woven a legacy of kindness and understanding that would carry on, inspiring countless others to believe in the power of empathy, one interaction at a time. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, compassion, and the power of small acts of kindness, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Your support helps us bring meaningful narratives like this one to life, reminding us all of the impact we can have on each other's lives. Subscribe now and join a community that believes in the power of empathy, one story at a time. Thank you for watching. Under her guidance, the hospital implemented regular empathy workshops, open to staff at all levels. Mrs. Grant also created a platform for patients to share their feedback directly, establishing a patient care advisory board where patients and family members could provide insight into their experiences. This initiative allowed patients to have a voice in shaping their own care, creating a feedback loop that empowered both patients and staff. Mrs. Grant felt proud of the culture shift within the hospital, knowing that her work would benefit generations of patients to come. She thought often of Amara and felt grateful for the courage she had shown. Mrs. Grant knew that her mission would continue as long as there were patients to serve and staff members willing to learn. Several months later, Amara and Daniel held a small gathering with close friends and family to celebrate their son's first milestones. It was a sunny afternoon, and laughter filled the air as loved ones gathered to celebrate the newest addition to their family. Amara looked around, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had supported her journey. As she watched her son play, she felt a profound sense of peace. Her experiences had been challenging, but they had also been transformative, teaching her the power of resilience and compassion. She knew that her advocacy work would continue, but for now, she was content to enjoy this moment, surrounded by the people she loved. When she and Daniel stepped aside for a quiet moment, he wrapped an arm around her, his voice soft and full of pride. "You've done something amazing, Amara. You've created change, not just in the hospital, but in so many lives." She smiled, leaning into him. "I couldn't have done it without you, Daniel. We did this together." They stood together, a united front, ready to face whatever challenges came next. Their journey was far from over, but they knew that whatever came their way, they would face it with the same strength and compassion that had brought them this far. In the months and years that followed, Amara's influence continued to ripple through the hospital and the community. Patients shared stories of the kindness they'd received from Emily, of the understanding and warmth that defined the new culture of the maternity ward. Staff members found fulfillment in their work, knowing they were part of a place where patients felt truly seen and heard. Emily, who eventually rose to a senior nursing position, continued her work in compassionate care, mentoring new nurses and ensuring that the values of empathy and kindness remained at the heart of their training. She often thought back to her interactions with Amara, grateful for the lesson that even small acts of compassion could have a powerful impact. As for Susan, she became a vocal advocate for empathy in nursing, finding joy in helping other healthcare professionals balance efficiency with compassion. She had found her purpose anew, and her patients felt the difference in every interaction. Susan's journey was a reminder that it was never too late to change, to grow, and to become the person she aspired to be. Amara's experience served as the foundation for a legacy of compassion that reached far beyond her hospital stay. Through her courage, resilience, and dedication to advocacy, she had helped create a culture where kindness and respect were the standard, not the exception. In this final part, the story reaches a heartwarming conclusion, with each character finding purpose, fulfillment, and strength through their growth. Amara's advocacy leaves a lasting impact on the hospital and community, creating a legacy of compassion that benefits future patients and healthcare professionals alike. This part emphasizes the themes of empathy, resilience, and positive change. The narrative remains respectful and advertiser-friendly, focusing on constructive growth and hopeful resolutions without explicit conflict. The characters' journeys conclude with a sense of unity and purpose, demonstrating the profound effects that kindness and courage can have on individuals and institutions alike. Inspired by Amara's influence, Mrs. Grant proposed an idea to the hospital board, a formal program dedicated to patient-centered care. With the board's enthusiastic approval, they named it the Amara Initiative, in honor of the woman whose courage had sparked a new standard in patient care. The initiative aimed to reinforce empathy and compassion as core values of the hospital's culture, integrating them into every aspect of patient interaction. The Amara Initiative included a mentorship program that paired seasoned nurses like Susan with new hires, guiding them through the nuances of patient-centered care. Staff members attended workshops, training sessions, and open forums where they could discuss their experiences, learn from one another, and support each other in their roles. In her role as a senior nurse, Emily volunteered as one of the initiative's first mentors, sharing her insights with incoming nurses who were eager to learn. Her mentorship approach was grounded in empathy, and she found that the initiative helped her continue honoring Amara's impact. She taught her ments the power of small gestures and the importance of making patients feel seen, planting the seeds of compassion that would carry on into future generations. Several months later, Amara was invited back to the hospital for a special event honoring the Amara Initiative. She was both humbled and excited to see the impact of her experience manifesting in real, positive change. Daniel, ever her steadfast partner, accompanied her, and together they walked through the hospital halls that now held a sense of familiarity and pride. In the conference room, Mrs. Grant introduced Amara to an audience of staff members, patients, and board members. She spoke of the initiative's purpose and how Amara's story had served as a catalyst for a new era of patient-centered care. Amara stepped up to the podium, her heart filled with gratitude as she looked out at the faces of those who had embraced her mission. She thanked Mrs. Grant, the hospital staff, and especially Emily, who had supported her when she needed it most. I hope this initiative reminds us all that each patient is more than a medical case. They are people with lives, stories, and emotions, she said. And when we recognize that, we create a place of healing not just for the body, but for the spirit. I am honored to know that my experience has played a role in building such a space. After the speech, Amara was approached by several young nurses, each eager to tell her how much her story had inspired them. They spoke of how the Amara initiative had shaped their approach to care, encouraging them to treat each patient with empathy and understanding. Amara felt deeply moved by their words, realizing that the legacy of her experience was not confined to her own story. It had become part of the hospital's identity. Under the mentorship framework of the Amara initiative, Susan found herself continuing her journey of transformation. Paired with a newly hired nurse, Rachel, Susan discovered that mentoring allowed her to share both her strengths and the hard-earned lessons of her own growth. During one of their mentoring sessions, Rachel confided her insecurities to Susan. "Sometimes I feel like I'll never find the right balance between getting the job done and really connecting with patients," she admitted, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Susan smiled, recognizing herself in the young nurse's words. "I used to struggle with the same thing," she said. "I focused so much on efficiency that I forgot there's more to nursing than tasks. But compassion doesn't have to slow you down. It just means being present, really seeing the person in front of you." Rachel looked up, relief softening her face. "Thank you. That makes me feel hopeful." Susan nodded, feeling a quiet pride. Mentoring Rachel allowed her to reflect on her own journey, and it reminded her that even the smallest acts of compassion could lead to profound changes. She had gone from resisting change to embracing it, and she felt fulfilled knowing she could pass on that growth to others. Emily's role in the Amara initiative grew as well. With her passion for compassionate care and her experience as a mentor, she was eventually asked to lead monthly workshops, guiding nurses and staff through practical ways to integrate empathy into their work. One day, she shared a story about Amara's stay in the hospital, explaining how small gestures had made a meaningful difference. "Every patient you meet is going through something unique," she said, her voice calm and encouraging. "You may not know their full story, but you have the power to make them feel valued in that moment." As Emily spoke, the room was filled with staff who felt her words deeply. Her message had a ripple effect, inspiring a renewed commitment among staff to approach each patient with understanding and kindness. Emily's workshops became a cornerstone of the Amara initiative, attracting staff members from all departments. Doctors, nurses, and administrative staff all joined, each of them motivated by the promise of creating a hospital where patients felt seen and supported. One afternoon, as Emily finished up a workshop, she noticed a familiar face in the audience. Amara had come to observe the workshop at Mrs. Grant's invitation, and she greeted Emily with a warm smile as they approached each other. "Emily," Amara said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I never got to thank you properly for what you did for me. Your kindness changed everything." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "It was an honor, Amara. Meeting you reminded me of why I became a nurse in the first place." The mother's face lit up with gratitude, and Susan felt a genuine connection. It was a small moment, but it reaffirmed her new approach, a quiet commitment to the kind of care she'd once believed to be irrelevant. As the days passed, Susan grew more comfortable with her new outlook, each interaction reinforcing her desire to make a positive impact. She knew she was only beginning this journey of change, but she was willing to keep learning, growing, and becoming the nurse she aspired to be. Meanwhile, Mrs. Grant continued her work to integrate empathy training as a regular part of the hospital's culture. Inspired by Amara's feedback and Emily's dedication, she developed a series of workshops focusing on compassionate care and patient-centered practices. Staff members from various departments attended, learning how to better connect with patients and understand the impact of even the smallest gestures. The training sessions sparked meaningful conversations and reflections among the staff, creating a gradual shift in the hospital's environment. Nurses and doctors began to share stories, to reflect on their own experiences with patients, and to discuss ways to improve the culture of care. Mrs. Grant felt a quiet pride in the changes taking place, knowing that Amara's courage had ignited this transformation. She hoped these efforts would not only improve patient satisfaction, but would also create a more fulfilling workplace for staff, a place where compassion and professionalism thrived side by side. The day of Amara's guest speaking engagement arrived, and she walked into the hospital's conference room with a mix of nerves and determination. She took a deep breath as she looked out at the faces in the audience, many of whom were nurses, doctors, and administrators. She began her story by sharing her journey through the hospital, describing the challenges she'd faced and the ways those experiences had affected her emotionally. Her words were honest but gentle, focused on the importance of empathy rather than on placing blame. "During my stay, there were moments when I felt invisible," she explained, her voice steady. "But then there were also moments of compassion, simple gestures that helped me feel seen and valued. Those small acts of kindness are what I remember most, what gave me the strength to get through it." Amara paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Every patient here has a story, a life that goes beyond their illness or their treatment. I hope that as you continue your work, you remember that every interaction, no matter how brief, has the power to heal. You are more than caretakers. You are beacons of hope." As she finished, the room was quiet, a shared sense of understanding settling over the audience. Mrs. Grant led a round of applause, and several staff members approached Amara afterward to thank her for her courage and insight. Amara felt a sense of closure, knowing her voice had reached those who could create change. Amara returned home that evening with a sense of peace. She had spoken her truth, and it had been heard. She could now move forward, focusing on her family and embracing the joys and challenges of motherhood. Her experience in the hospital would remain a part of her, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it was a reminder of her strength and the power of empathy. In the following months, she received occasional updates from Mrs. Grant, sharing news of new training sessions and patient-centered care initiatives that had been implemented as a result of her feedback. Amara felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing her story had helped to inspire lasting change. For Emily, the months that followed were filled with growth and gratitude. She continued to lead by example, her commitment to kindness influencing her colleagues and patients alike. She often thought of Amara, grateful for the bond they'd shared and the lessons she'd learned. Emily saw herself not just as a nurse, but as a catalyst for compassion, someone who could make a difference one patient at a time. As for Susan, she continued her journey of self-reflection and change. Though she sometimes struggled with her old habits, each day brought her closer to becoming the compassionate nurse she aspired to be. She found that her interactions with patients now carried a sense of fulfillment, a purpose that gave new meaning to her work. In the months following her discharge, Amara embraced her role as a new mother, but her experience in the hospital continued to resonate with her. She had made a promise to herself to advocate for compassion in healthcare, and she was determined to follow through. Inspired by her hospital stay, she began working with local community leaders and healthcare professionals to address the need for empathetic patient care in hospitals. Amara started small, organizing support groups for recent mothers who had felt isolated or unheard during their hospital experiences. She held monthly meetings at a community center, where women could share their stories and find solidarity. Word quickly spread, and soon the meetings grew, attracting patients, families, and even healthcare workers interested in learning more about the patient experience. As Amara spoke to larger groups, she shared her personal story of resilience and advocacy, using her voice to encourage others to demand compassionate care. Her journey inspired other women to speak up, creating a ripple effect in the community. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her story was helping others find the courage to advocate for themselves. Daniel continued to support Amara's advocacy work, but he also felt a renewed sense of purpose in his own life. He realized that his support for Amara had deepened his understanding of what it meant to be a true partner, not only in their marriage, but in life's challenges as well. Inspired by her dedication, he took on a volunteer role with a local healthcare advocacy organization, using his skills to help other families navigate the complexities of healthcare. Daniel worked on developing informational materials for patients and their families, designed to help them better understand their rights and access the resources available to them. He coordinated workshops that provided people with knowledge about patient advocacy and the importance of self-advocacy in medical settings. His work allowed him to contribute to the cause in a way that resonated with him, supporting Amara's mission while also creating a meaningful impact in his own right. Through this experience, Daniel found a new sense of balance and partnership in their marriage. He understood that Amara's experience had shaped them both, and he was proud to stand beside her, offering his support as they worked toward a shared vision of change. Back at the hospital, Emily had become something of an unofficial ambassador for patient-centered care. Her gentle, empathic approach had not only made a difference in her interactions with patients, but it had also started to influence her colleagues. Nurses and staff often approach her for advice, asking how they, too, could bring a more compassionate approach to their work. Emily began hosting small compassionate care workshops during her lunch breaks, sharing techniques for making patients feel valued, even during the busiest days. She taught her colleagues small but impactful practices, like maintaining eye contact, listening actively, and addressing patients by name. She even introduced relaxation techniques to help nurses manage stress, knowing that a calm, focused mind was essential to providing the best care possible. Her efforts had a lasting impact on the ward, creating a more positive environment for both patients and staff. The maternity ward had become known as a place where patients felt respected, and this new reputation brought a sense of pride to the staff. Emily knew she was making a difference, one small step at a time, and she felt grateful to have found her purpose within the hospital. For Susan, the journey was more personal and internal. Her initial resistance to empathy training had softened, and she continued to explore her role as a nurse with a new perspective. She had come to realize that her approach had been shaped by years of professional detachment, and it took time to unlearn those habits and embrace a more compassionate approach. One evening, Susan received a message from Mrs. Grant, inviting her to participate in an upcoming panel on the role of empathy in healthcare. Mrs. Grant had noticed Susan's efforts to change, and she believed Susan's journey could inspire other seasoned professionals who might struggle with similar issues. Susan accepted the invitation, though she felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. On the day of the panel, she shared her story openly, describing the challenges of adjusting her approach and the fulfillment she'd found in rediscovering her purpose as a caregiver. Her honesty and humility resonated with the audience, especially with other nurses who had faced the same struggles. Afterward, several younger nurses approached Susan, thanking her for her openness. She felt a sense of pride, knowing that her journey had come full circle. She'd once been the nurse who resisted change, but now she was committed to continuous growth, knowing that her patients and her colleagues deserved nothing less. Mrs. Grant continued her work as a patient advocate, feeling a renewed sense of purpose in the wake of Amara's influence. She had seen firsthand how a single patient's story could spark lasting change, and she remained dedicated to making the hospital a place where every patient felt valued. Susan walked briskly through the halls, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite untangle. She had begun the empathy training Mrs. Grant had recommended, and though she'd resisted it initially, she couldn't deny that some of the material struck a chord. She had never intended to make patients feel neglected or unseen, but in her focus on efficiency and professionalism, she wondered if she had lost sight of something essential. She thought of Amara, her soft, hesitant voice, the quiet dignity in her eyes, and the faint but persistent feeling that she had failed her. It was difficult to confront this sense of vulnerability, but Susan couldn't ignore it any longer. She knew she had choices to make, choices about the kind of nurse she wanted to be, the kind of environment she wanted to help foster. As she approached Mrs. Grant's office, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her next steps pressing down on her. She knocked on the door, and Mrs. Grant invited her in with a welcoming smile. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mrs. Grant," Susan began, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation and the feedback from patients. I realize I might not have been as compassionate as I should have been. Mrs. Grant's expression was understanding. Thank you for sharing that, Susan. Change isn't easy, but it's never too late to grow. I believe that every one of us has the ability to make a difference, especially those who have the courage to reflect and adapt. Susan nodded, her resolve strengthening. I want to do better, for my patients and for myself. Mrs. Grant gave her a warm smile. That's all I ask, Susan. And know that you're not alone. We're here to support you. Susan left the office feeling a strange but welcome sense of hope. For the first time, she felt that perhaps she could rediscover the purpose she'd once had when she first chose to become a nurse. The following morning, Amara met with Mrs. Grant in a small, comfortable room just off the main corridor. She held a file of notes she'd prepared, her expression calm but determined. Thank you for meeting with me, Mrs. Grant, Amara began, her voice steady. I appreciate the chance to share my experience here. I know that the staff here works hard, but I believe there are areas where patients could feel more supported. Mrs. Grant nodded, listening closely as Amara described her experiences with Susan and Emily. She emphasized the difference that kindness had made in her stay, explaining how the compassion Emily showed her had given her the strength to endure the more difficult moments. I think it's important that patients, especially those who might be hesitant to speak up, feel valued, Amara concluded. I know this is just one story, but I believe that empathy can and should be a priority in every part of care. Mrs. Grant leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. Amara, I want to thank you for your honesty and bravery. It takes courage to speak up, especially on behalf of others. I'll be sharing your insights with the board, and I believe your feedback will have a lasting impact on our patient care practices. As they finished the meeting, Amara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had shared her voice, her experience, and it was being heard. She left the meeting feeling a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that her story might help shape a better environment for future patients. Later that afternoon, Susan took a deep breath, gathering her courage as she approached Amara's room. She knocked softly and stepped inside, her face reflecting a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. Mrs. Johnson, Susan began, her tone softer than usual. I wanted to apologize. I realize that my treatment of you may have made you feel overlooked. That was never my intention, but I understand that it happened nonetheless. Amara looked at her, surprised but appreciative of the gesture. She nodded, her expression open. Thank you, Nurse Whitfield. I appreciate you saying that. Susan swallowed, feeling the weight of her own words. I'm working on being more compassionate, on finding a better balance. I hope that future patients feel the care they deserve. Amara's face softened, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. I know this work isn't easy, but I believe that you can make a difference, Susan. And I appreciate you taking the time to say this. They exchanged a brief but genuine smile, and Susan felt a sense of closure as she left the room. She knew she had work to do, but she felt a new determination to carry it forward. 2 days later, Amara and her newborn were discharged, and Daniel arrived to take them home. As she gathered her things, she felt a sense of resolution and quiet pride. Her journey in the hospital had not been easy, but she had spoken her truth, and it had mattered. Emily stopped by one last time, offering her a hug and a final word of encouragement. You take care, Mrs. Johnson, and if you ever need anything, just let us know. Amara smiled, her heart full. Thank you, Emily. You made such a difference, and I won't forget it. As Amara and Daniel left the hospital, she felt a sense of peace. She had faced adversity, spoken up, and contributed to a change, however small. She knew her story was just beginning, and she felt ready to continue it, her spirit stronger for the journey. As Daniel drove Amara and their newborn son home, a peaceful silence filled the car. Amara leaned her head back, watching the cityscape pass by, a sense of relief mingling with a new resolve. The past week had been a difficult journey, filled with both joy and hardship, but she felt she was leaving stronger than when she arrived. Daniel reached over and gently squeezed her hand. You did an incredible thing, Amara. Speaking up like that. I know it wasn't easy. She nodded, looking down at their son nestled in his car seat. I think I needed to. For him. For all of us. She paused, her gaze softening. I didn't want this experience to define me as someone who just accepted being overlooked. Daniel's expression was warm and proud. You've shown me again just how strong you are. They continued home in quiet understanding, the road ahead symbolic of the new beginning they shared. For Amara, the journey was more than a drive home. It was a transition into a new chapter, one where her voice, her family, and her experiences would guide her toward making a difference. In the weeks that followed, Amara found herself reflecting on her experience at the hospital with a mixture of clarity and determination. She knew her time there had changed her, revealing the power of empathy and the importance of patient advocacy in ways she hadn't fully grasped before. She began to research patient advocacy initiatives, joining online communities, and reading about other people's experiences. One day, she received an email from Mrs. Grant, expressing gratitude for Amara's insights and asking if she'd consider serving as a guest speaker for a staff meeting at the hospital. The invitation filled Amara with a renewed sense of purpose. She accepted, knowing this was a chance to continue the work she'd started. She wanted to share her story, not out of resentment, but to inspire positive change. If her voice could contribute to creating an environment where every patient felt seen, she was willing to speak up. As she prepared for her talk, she focused on the small, meaningful ways staff could make a difference, drawing from the moments with Emily that had restored her strength and dignity. Amara hoped her words would resonate and encourage even the most seasoned professionals to see patients not as tasks to complete, but as people deserving of compassion. Emily continued her work in the maternity ward with a quiet sense of fulfillment, knowing that her commitment to empathy had made a real difference. Inspired by Amara's gratitude, she made it her mission to help her colleagues see the importance of compassion in patient care. One afternoon, she organized an informal gathering with other nurses, sharing her own experiences and insights on patient-centered care. To her surprise, several colleagues expressed similar frustrations and a desire to bring more warmth into their work. The discussion felt like a turning point, a small but significant shift in the culture around her. As she continued with her rounds, Emily noticed subtle changes in the way her colleagues interacted with patients. Gentler tones, patient smiles, a few extra moments spent offering comfort. It was a ripple effect, a reminder that even small efforts could inspire meaningful change. Emily felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that her work mattered beyond her individual actions. She was part of something larger, something that could transform the hospital into a place of genuine healing. In the weeks following her conversation with Mrs. Grant, Susan found herself thinking often of Amara and the quiet impact of her experience. The empathy training sessions she'd initially resisted had gradually opened her eyes, challenging her to confront her biases and recognize the importance of seeing patients as individuals. One morning, as Susan prepared for her shift, she felt a new resolve. She was determined to approach her work differently, to let go of the rigid habits she'd built up over the years. Her efficiency had once been her pride, but now she realized that empathy and professionalism could coexist, creating a balance that served her patients' needs. Her first opportunity came when she entered the room of a young mother who looked up at her with the same tentative expression she'd seen in Amara's eyes. For the first time, Susan offered a warm smile and asked, "How are you feeling? Is there anything I can do to make you more comfortable?" Daniel's determination to support Amara continued to drive him forward. After his conversation with Mrs. Grant, he followed up with a formal email, expressing his gratitude for her willingness to listen, but emphasizing his continued concerns. He highlighted Amara's feeling of isolation, explaining that the indifference she experienced had affected her mental and emotional well-being, detracting from the joy of bringing their son into the world. Mrs. Grant responded promptly, assuring Daniel that she had taken his concerns to heart. She explained that the hospital was reviewing its patient care practices in light of Amara's experience, and that the nursing staff would be undergoing additional training in empathy and patient-centered care. Daniel felt a flicker of hope. He knew this wouldn't change things overnight, but it was a sign that the hospital valued its patients enough to listen and respond. After reading Mrs. Grant's email, Daniel shared the news with Amara. She looked up at him, a mix of relief and apprehension in her eyes. "Thank you, Daniel," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't know anyone would take it seriously. They should, Amara. You deserve respect, and I won't stop fighting until you get it," he replied, his tone resolute. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as they sat together in silence, comforted by the small but significant step forward. Susan's demeanor had grown even more strained since the staff meeting and the subtle scrutiny she felt from Mrs. Grant's recent review. It was as though every interaction with a patient now carried an invisible weight, a pressure to be more caring that felt artificial and burdensome. In her years as a nurse, Susan had grown accustomed to her own way of doing things, a rhythm that suited her. She resented the suggestion that she wasn't enough, that her professionalism and efficiency somehow fell short. Yet, she couldn't ignore the quiet voices around her, the murmurs from her colleagues who seemed to welcome the new emphasis on empathy. One afternoon, she noticed Emily lingering in a patient's room, chatting softly with an elderly woman recovering from surgery. Susan watched from the doorway, feeling a mixture of irritation and confusion. What did Emily gain from spending extra time with each patient, from offering those seemingly unnecessary gestures of warmth? Susan felt her jaw tighten. She couldn't understand how anyone found the energy for it. When Emily finally emerged, Susan's expression was carefully controlled. "Emily," she began, her tone clipped, "I hope you're keeping up with your rounds. We're here to be efficient, not to indulge every patient's need for attention." Emily met Susan's gaze, her expression steady but respectful. "I believe a few minutes of kindness can make a difference, Susan," she replied gently. "It doesn't take much, and it helps the patients feel cared for." Susan's face hardened, but she said nothing, turning away. She didn't like how Emily's words unsettled her, how they chipped away at her confidence. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps there was something she wasn't seeing, something Emily and her peers understood that she'd lost sight of. A few days later, Mrs. Grant called a private meeting with Susan to discuss the findings of a review. Susan entered the office, her expression carefully neutral, her posture stiff as she took a seat across from Mrs. Grant. "Thank you for meeting with me, Susan," Mrs. Grant began, her tone professional but kind. "I wanted to go over some feedback we've received from patients in the maternity ward. I'm sure you understand that our goal is to provide a comfortable, compassionate environment for everyone who comes through our doors." Susan nodded, her face betraying nothing. "Of course," Mrs. Grant continued, her gaze steady. "One of the things that came up in our review was a need for more patient-centered care, particularly in cases where patients may feel vulnerable or overlooked. I know you're dedicated to your work, Susan, but sometimes a bit more warmth can make a significant difference." Susan shifted in her seat, her expression a mix of discomfort and frustration. "I understand the need for compassion, Mrs. Grant, but I also have a duty to be efficient. With so many patients, it's not always possible to spend extra time with each one." Mrs. Grant nodded, acknowledging the challenge. "I understand that time is a factor, but we believe that even small gestures, a warm greeting, a few kind words, can go a long way in making patients feel valued. We're asking all staff to undergo additional training on patient empathy, and I think it could be beneficial for you as well." Susan's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to nod. "I'll do my best to incorporate the feedback." Mrs. Grant offered a gentle smile. "Thank you, Susan. I know change isn't easy, but I believe you have the capacity to make a difference." "We all do." As Susan left the meeting, her thoughts churned with conflicting emotions. She had never questioned her approach before, but Mrs. Grant's words left her feeling strangely vulnerable. She wondered if, perhaps, there was truth in what the patient advocate had said. Amara sensed a subtle change in the atmosphere over the next few days. The interactions with Susan remained cool, but she noticed small differences, an extra moment of eye contact, a polite acknowledgement when she asked a question. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start, and she clung to that glimmer of improvement. One evening, she lay awake in her hospital bed, reflecting on how this experience had challenged her. She had always considered herself a strong, confident woman, unafraid to speak her mind. But here, in the face of Susan's indifference, she had felt reduced, as if her needs were a burden. As she held her son close, she resolved that this experience would not define her. Instead, she would find a way to make sure no other patient felt the same sense of isolation. She would channel her feelings into something positive, a movement toward change that would ripple beyond her own experience. The next morning, Amara asked Emily for a brochure about the hospital's patient advocacy board. She wasn't entirely sure how she would approach it, but she felt a newfound sense of purpose. This hospital stay had opened her eyes to the importance of compassionate care, and she was determined to be part of the solution. Amara sat quietly, a patient advocacy pamphlet resting in her lap as she looked out the hospital window at the city skyline. She was going home soon, but she felt an odd mixture of relief and unfinished business. Her experience here had left her feeling vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated, and it gnawed at her, a feeling that wouldn't be fully resolved without action. She thought about the moments of warmth Emily had shown her, the gentle care that made her feel acknowledged, and the difference it had made in her experience. Those small acts of kindness had helped her maintain her dignity, even when Susan's treatment had left her feeling invisible. Emily's support gave her hope that compassion could, indeed, be part of every patient's care. With a deep breath, she made up her mind. She would speak up, not out of anger, but from a desire to ensure that future patients, especially those who might be hesitant to advocate for themselves, received the respect and care they deserved. She reached for her phone and sent a message to Mrs. Grant, requesting a meeting to discuss her experience and offer feedback. When Daniel arrived later that afternoon, he noticed the sense of resolve in Amara's expression. She was holding a small folder, a look of determination in her eyes. "Hey, love," he greeted her, giving her a gentle kiss on the forehead. "What's this?" Amara held up the pamphlet. "I'm meeting with Mrs. Grant. I want to tell her what I experienced here. I think it's important that she understands how much those small moments of kindness, like the ones Emily showed me, made a difference. I want to be part of making sure that kind of care becomes the standard, not the exception." Daniel's face softened with pride as he took her hand in his. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Amara. You have a voice, and people will listen." They sat together in comfortable silence, Daniel's hand resting on her shoulder as she held their son. For the first time in days, Amara felt a sense of peace. She was finding her strength again, her purpose, and it gave her hope that this experience would not be in vain. Meanwhile, Emily had been quietly doing what she could to spread her values of patient-centered care among her colleagues. She shared her thoughts about patient empathy with other nurses, suggesting small ways they could make patients feel valued. Some responded with enthusiasm, while others were more skeptical, but Emily remained persistent, determined to model the compassion she believed in. During her break, she read a memo Mrs. Grant had distributed, emphasizing the importance of compassion and care and suggesting resources for those interested in learning more about patient-centered practices. Emily felt a surge of gratitude for Mrs. Grant's efforts, which echoed the values she herself held dear. Later, Emily dropped by Amara's room, noticing the light in her eyes. "Hi, Mrs. Johnson. How's everything?" Amara smiled, a new sense of purpose in her expression. "Better, actually. Thank you for everything you did to make my stay bearable, Emily. It really made a difference." Emily felt a lump in her throat, deeply moved by Amara's words. "I'm just glad I could be here for you. And if you ever need anything after you leave, please don't hesitate to reach out." They exchanged a warm smile, and as Emily left the room, she felt an even stronger commitment to the kind of care she had come to believe in. When Daniel arrived that afternoon, he noticed the dark circles under Amara's eyes and the weary expression she wore, her smile lacking its usual warmth. "Amara, love," he began gently, sitting beside her. "Are you all right? You seem tired." Amara managed a faint smile. "It's just, I thought this would be a time of joy and celebration, but it feels like every day I'm fighting just to feel seen." Daniel's brow furrowed, and he took her hand in his fingers wrapping around hers protectively. "I'm sorry, Amara. I wish I could be here every moment with you." He paused, an idea sparking in his mind. "If it would help, I could talk to someone here. Maybe even to the hospital's administration." Amara felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by her concern about causing trouble. I don't know. I don't want to make things worse. I just wanted to be treated like I matter. Daniel's gaze was steady, his tone firm. You do matter, Amara. And if someone here doesn't see that, then it's on them, not you. I'll be here to support you, no matter what. She took a deep breath, feeling his resolve bolster her own. Maybe talking to someone wouldn't be a bad idea. But let's do it carefully. I don't want to cause a scene. Daniel nodded, his expression resolute. I'll make sure it's handled discreetly. You deserve to feel supported, and I'll do whatever I can to make sure that happens. As they sat together, a sense of shared determination grew between them. It was clear to Daniel that this was more than a matter of discomfort for Amara. It was a matter of dignity, and he was prepared to stand by her side every step of the way. Later that day, Susan received a subtle but firm email from the hospital's administration, requesting her attendance at an upcoming staff meeting focused on patient care standards. Her fingers tightened around her tablet as she read the email, feeling a wave of irritation rise within her. The hospital was known for its rigorous standards, but lately, it seemed there was an increasing emphasis on patient satisfaction that she found unnecessary. In Susan's view, patients came to the hospital to be treated medically, not emotionally. Her frustration grew as she thought back to her last conversation with Emily, an encounter that had left her feeling questioned in a way she hadn't expected. In her years at the hospital, Susan had cultivated a reputation for being efficient, for moving through her rounds without fuss. She didn't have time for hand-holding or unnecessary sentimentality. And yet, it seemed that her approach was becoming out of favor, a fact that left her feeling strangely unsettled. As she walked down the hallway, her mind returned to Amara. She recalled the way Amara had looked at her, cautious, hesitant, as if she were afraid to speak up. A small voice in the back of her mind wondered if she had perhaps been too distant. But she brushed the thought away, convincing herself that her approach was simply professional. She moved down the hallway, determined to put her frustrations aside, but a lingering sense of unease remained. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps her detached demeanor wasn't as effective as she'd once believed. Emily stopped by Amara's room later that day, her expression softening as she noticed Amara's tired eyes. She moved quietly, carrying a small cup of water and a warm blanket. Mrs. Johnson, I thought you might like a little something extra, Emily said gently, draping the blanket over Amara's shoulders. Amara's face softened, her expression grateful. Thank you, Emily. You're so thoughtful. It's my pleasure, Emily replied, a touch of warmth in her voice. And I just wanted you to know if there's anything else you need, anything I could do to make your stay here a little better, just say the word. Amara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, a rush of gratitude filling her chest. You don't know how much this means to me. Thank you, truly. Emily gave a gentle smile, feeling a sense of fulfillment in the small gesture. As she left the room, she resolved to do whatever she could to ensure Amara felt cared for. Even if it was in small ways, she was determined to be a presence of comfort and understanding in Amara's experience. That evening, after speaking with Amara, Daniel visited the hospital's patient advocacy office, where he met with Mrs. Lydia Grant, a seasoned patient advocate with years of experience handling complex situations. Mrs. Grant greeted him with a warm but professional demeanor, sensing the seriousness in his expression. Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming in, Mrs. Grant said, offering him a seat. How can I assist you today? Daniel took a steadying breath, choosing his words carefully. It's about my wife, Amara. She's felt overlooked during her stay here. I know that hospitals can be busy, but I believe patients should feel both medically and emotionally supported. Mrs. Grant listened intently, nodding as she took notes. I understand. Our goal is to make sure all patients feel valued and cared for, so if there's anything falling short, we want to address it. It's her primary nurse, Daniel continued. She's been dismissive. It's not that she's doing anything overtly wrong, but Amara feels ignored. And that's not something I take lightly. Mrs. Grant's expression grew serious. I'll see to it that this is looked into. We value your feedback, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure your wife's concerns are addressed. Daniel felt a sense of relief, knowing that his concerns had been heard. Thank you, Mrs. Grant. It means a lot to know this is being taken seriously. As Daniel left, he felt a renewed sense of hope. He knew that change could be slow, but he trusted that Mrs. Grant would make sure Amara's voice wasn't lost in the shuffle. In the following days, Mrs. Grant quietly conducted a review of the patient care practices in the maternity ward. She observed interactions between nurses and patients, noting the subtle but telling differences in each nurse's approach. She saw how Emily took the time to connect with patients, offering reassurance and warmth, while Susan's demeanor was one of brisk detachment, her interactions functional but lacking empathy. At the next staff meeting, Mrs. Grant shared her observations, highlighting the importance of compassionate care. She emphasized that patients needed more than just physical treatment. They needed kindness, patience, and the assurance that they were seen and heard. Emily felt a sense of pride as Mrs. Grant spoke, recognizing the impact of her efforts. But she also noticed the tension in Susan's expression, the way her shoulders stiffened as Mrs. Grant discussed the need for a more personalized approach. Susan's jaw clenched, her gaze fixed on her notepad, a quiet storm brewing behind her eyes. After the meeting, Emily approached Susan, her tone gentle. "Susan, if there's anything you need help with, I'm here." Susan looked at her, her expression guarded. "Thank you, Emily. But I think I know how to handle my patients." Emily nodded, sensing that pushing further would only create more resistance. But she felt a growing determination to continue offering the kind of care she believed in, knowing that even small acts of compassion could have a profound impact. The following day, Amara felt the emotional weight of her hospital stay more acutely. As she sat in her room, holding her son close, she found herself reflecting on how quickly joy had turned into loneliness within these walls. She had come here full of excitement and hope, but the experience had left her feeling invisible. Susan's dismissive attitude lingered in her mind, overshadowing even the sweet, quiet moments she shared with her newborn. She knew that asking for a little help, a touch of empathy, shouldn't feel like a burden. But here, each interaction with Susan made her feel as though her needs were too much, her presence too inconvenient. She tried her best to remain polite, careful not to appear demanding, but it seemed that her mere existence challenged the cold professionalism that defined Susan's approach. Her thoughts drifted to Daniel, to his steady support and his quiet advocacy on her behalf. She felt a surge of gratitude for his patience and strength. Knowing he was willing to fight for her helped her find a measure of resolve. She was determined to find meaning in this experience, to turn it into something that could help others, even if she didn't yet know how. Meanwhile, Emily found herself thinking often of Amara and the importance of her own role in the hospital. She had always believed that nursing was more than just medical care. It was a chance to be a beacon of compassion for people in their most vulnerable moments. Watching Susan's approach to patient care had only strengthened Emily's commitment to treating her patients with empathy and understanding. In her downtime, Emily began researching the effects of patient-centered care, reading studies that underscored the impact of empathy on healing and recovery. She felt encouraged to see that the research supported what she'd always known intuitively. People healed better when they felt seen and heard. Emily started making small changes in her daily routine, taking an extra minute to listen to each patient, offering gentle reassurances, and meeting their gaze with warmth. She knew it was a modest step, but it was a start. She hoped that in her own quiet way, she could make the hospital a better place for people like Amara, patients who needed a bit more than just physical treatment. She allowed herself a moment to close her eyes, the weight of the day pressing down on her. In truth, she didn't resent the work itself. She had chosen nursing for a reason. Years ago, when she was young and idealistic, filled with the desire to help others. But over time, the endless demands, long hours, and the constant expectation to give without limits had left her feeling drained. Somewhere along the way, that idealism had hardened, turning into a kind of numb practicality. Her thoughts drifted back to her interactions with Amara. She remembered the young mother's timid requests, the way Amara looked at her with a quiet desperation that tugged at something deep within Susan. But Susan brushed it off, telling herself that she was just being efficient. She didn't have time for the kind of coddling that young nurses like Emily were prone to. She took a sip of her coffee, her gaze distant. She couldn't deny that Amara's presence lingered in her mind, as though something about their interactions was out of place, unsettling. But she dismissed the thought, convincing herself that she was simply doing her job. If her patients needed warmth, they could get that from their families. The next morning, Amara woke to a pale light filtering through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the room. She felt a dull ache in her back, a reminder of the labor she had just endured. She shifted carefully, glancing over at her newborn, who lay peacefully in his small bassinet nearby. Her heart swelled with love, but a flicker of anxiety crept in as she thought about the day ahead. Shortly after she settled in, Susan arrived to perform her morning check. Her expression was as controlled as ever, her movements swift and precise. Without any greeting, she adjusted the four, took Amara's temperature, and noted her vitals, her face giving nothing away. Amara swallowed, gathering her courage. "Nurse Whitfield," she began hesitantly. "I was wondering if I could see the doctor today, just to discuss some lingering pain." Susan barely glanced up from her chart. "The doctor will be in when he has time. You're recovering well? Pain is normal." Amara's heart sank at the dismissive tone. "I understand, but I just wanted to be sure." Susan's expression grew tight, though she kept her voice even. "We have a schedule to maintain, Mrs. Johnson. I'll let you know if the doctor is available." She made a quick note on her clipboard and turned to leave without further acknowledgement. As the door clicked shut, Amara felt a familiar heaviness settle over her. She was too tired to keep trying to reach Susan, too weary to ask for the compassion she wasn't sure Susan would ever give. Her mind wandered to Emily's gentle kindness from the day before, and she wished, just for a moment, that all her caregivers were like that young nurse. She picked up her phone, deciding to send a quick text to Daniel. "Amara, morning love. All's well, but Susan is making things a bit hard here." Daniel's reply came almost immediately. "Daniel, I'm sorry, love. Want me to talk to someone?" Amara stared at the message, conflicted. She wanted to say yes, but part of her feared causing more trouble. "Amara, no, each is okay. Just being strong for our little guy." Daniel's reply was supportive, yet laced with an undertone of worry. "Daniel, you're amazing, Amara. I'll be there this evening." Amara put down her phone, feeling a bit better, but knowing Daniel's presence could only go so far. What she really needed was a place where she felt cared for. Emily's day began with her usual rounds, moving from patient to patient with a warmth that set her apart from the often cool efficiency of the other nurses. She couldn't help but think of Mrs. Johnson as she moved through the maternity ward. She remembered the gratitude in Amara's eyes when she'd brought the extra pillow, the way Amara had looked at her as if Emily were the only person who had truly seen her. When Emily noticed that Susan was assigned to check on Amara again, she hesitated, debating whether to intervene. She admired Susan's experience and authority, but something about the way Susan approached her work had begun to trouble her. There was a line between efficiency and indifference, and Emily wasn't sure which side of that line Susan was standing on. Her thoughts were interrupted by Susan herself, who approached with her usual briskness. Susan noticed Emily's expression and raised an eyebrow. "Something on your mind, Emily?" Susan asked, her tone a touch sharper than usual. Emily hesitated, then forced herself to speak. "I was just thinking about Mrs. Johnson. I know she's been asking for extra help, and maybe it wouldn't hurt to give her a bit more attention." Susan's face hardened slightly. "Emily, I appreciate your concern, but we can't indulge every request. Patients need to understand that this isn't a five-star hotel." Emily nodded, feeling a pang of frustration. "Of course, but she's a new mom, and I think she might just need a bit of encouragement." Susan's lips pressed into a thin line. "Let's not coddle our patients. We're here to provide medical care, not emotional hand-holding." Emily felt a wave of disappointment, but kept her expression neutral. "Understood, Susan." As Susan moved down the hall, Emily remained where she was, her heart heavy. She couldn't shake the feeling that Amara's needs were being unfairly dismissed, and she resolved to check in on her when she had a free moment. If Susan wouldn't offer compassion, then Emily would do her best to provide what little support she could. Susan's next encounter with Amara felt charged, the tension between them almost palpable. As she checked the 4-line, Susan noticed that Amara was watching her carefully, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and guardedness. "Nurse Whitfield," Amara began, her voice soft but steady. "Could I ask you, is there a reason why it's been hard to get extra help here?" Susan paused, surprised by the question. She looked at Amara, her eyes narrowing slightly. "As I said before, we're a busy hospital, Mrs. Johnson. We can't always meet every request immediately." "I understand that," Amara replied, her voice gentle but insistent. I'd hoped for a bit more understanding." Susan's expression grew cold. "We're here to provide medical support, Mrs. Johnson. If you're uncomfortable, I suggest you speak with the patient advocate." Amara's cheeks flushed, and she looked down, feeling the sting of Susan's words. She hadn't wanted to confront Susan, but the constant dismissiveness had worn her down. This wasn't the compassionate care she had envisioned when she'd arrived at the hospital. "Thank you, Nurse Whitfield," she said quietly, a note of resignation in her voice. Susan gave a curt nod, as if the conversation were closed, and turned to leave. That night, as Amara held her newborn and watched the city lights twinkle beyond the hospital window, she let herself reflect on the experiences of the past few days. She felt an ache in her heart, not just from the labor and recovery, but from the emotional exhaustion of feeling unseen. Her mind drifted back to moments in her life when she had advocated for others, when she'd used her voice to lift up those who felt silenced. She remembered the strength she'd found in community, in the support she'd given and received. And now, as she sat alone in her hospital room, she realized that this was one of those times. One of those moments when she had to speak up, not just for herself, but for the countless others who might feel this same way. She pressed a gentle kiss to her newborn's forehead, drawing courage from his presence. "Mama's got you," she whispered, a promise as much to herself as to him. As she drifted into a restless sleep, a resolve began to form within her. She wouldn't leave this experience unspoken. When she was ready, she would find a way to ensure her voice was heard. The next morning, Amara awoke to her son's soft cries and the faint morning light filtering in through the blinds. She rubbed her tired eyes, a sense of determination settling in her chest. The past few days had been a whirlwind of joy and frustration, each new milestone of motherhood marred slightly by the growing discomfort in her hospital stay. Not long after she fed her son, Emily entered the room, her expression warm as she approached Amara with her usual kindness. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," Emily greeted her, glancing over at the baby. "And good morning to this little guy." Amara felt a wave of relief wash over her at Emily's presence. "Thank you, Emily. I really appreciate you checking in on us," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Of course," Emily replied gently, lowering her voice. "If you need anything that maybe I can help with, please don't hesitate to ask." Amara looked at Emily, sensing the sincerity in her words. She felt the urge to express the frustrations that had been building inside her, but she hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. But Emily's encouraging expression reassured her, so she took a steadying breath. I feel like I'm not really seen here," Amara admitted softly, her voice a bit strained. "I know it's silly, but every time I ask for help, it feels like I'm just another task to be done." Emily listened intently, her brow furrowing with concern. "That's not silly at all," she said gently. "You're going through something huge. Feeling supported should be the least of what you get here." Amara let out a soft sigh, a weight lifting slightly. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." Emily gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm here to help however I can. And if there's anything that doesn't feel right, you let me know." Amara nodded, grateful for the empathy she felt from Emily. Even if Susan's indifference couldn't be changed, it helped to know that at least one person understood.